Good afternoon. Could I have your attention, please? Good afternoon. Hi. Could I get everyone in the audience to just put your phones on silent if you haven't already, and we'll get started. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Cara Augustenborg. I'm an assistant professor in landscape studies and environmental policy at UCD, and I'm also a member of Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council. And we're delighted that you all could join us today for our first hybrid event, both in person and with quite a large viewership online. It's the first time I've ever chaired a hybrid event, so exciting for me. And also huge thanks to our hosts at TU Dublin who have set all of this up and all of this technology to make this possible. So today we welcome participants from higher education, government, and enterprise. And actually, if you're viewing online, we have closed captioning. If you want to change the size of your closed captions, you can press the little CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we're delighted to be joined today by our keynote speaker, Minister Eamon Ryan, our panelists, Laura Burke, Jennifer Boyer, Professor John O'Halloran, who is joining us online, and Ross Boyd, who's here in person, and I'll introduce them properly for our discussion section. And Professor Halloran, who I think you'll be able to see here for those of you in the audience, but he'll now put his camera on silent and mute for a few minutes before he rejoins us. So what we're ultimately trying to do today is discuss the role of universities in addressing both the climate and biodiversity crises and the development of solutions to solve these societal and environmental challenges, and also to accelerate action in moving toward a carbon neutral and more sustainable society. And I think also here it's to get into a discussion about what more can be done in this space. So first, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for the event, Minister Eamon Ryan. If you don't know Minister Eamon Ryan, he is the Minister for Environment, Climate, Communications, and the Minister for Transport since June 2020, when he was elected in the Dublin Bay South region in the general election, and he's also been the leader of the Green Party since 2011. Ayman is a graduate from UCD in Commerce, and then went on after graduation to work for the UCD School of Business and set up Dublin Cycling Safaris, and also found the Dublin Cycling Campaign. Ayman began his political career as a Dublin City Councillor for the Rathgar-Rathmines ward, and went on to serve as both a TD for Dublin South and also as Government Minister for Communications, Energy, and Natural Resources before his most recent responsibility. So Ayman, I'll hand the podium to you.
Cara, thank you very much indeed. I'm very glad to be here to contribute some thoughts and then join the panel for discussions. The government has only this week published its Impact 2030 Ireland's Research and Innovation Strategy. Minister Simon Harris, approved by Cabinet recently, launched it. I want to go some very broad perspective, take some elements of that, but give my own personal perspective on what are the roles of universities in this leap, this transition we need to make to a low-carbon, biodiverse, stable, secure economy. And just very broadly, at first, I suppose, recognising this government has three key tasks that we put centre stage in our programme for government and are still centre stage today. It is addressing the housing crisis, which has huge impact, particularly on our younger people. It is reforming health. It was managing to get through COVID, but now it's looking to take some of that flexible operating approach we had in COVID to reform a health system. Some of the sort of work that Martin Curley is doing within the HSE, if anyone's working with him, I think is really informative about using new digital technologies, remote sensory technologies to help us improve our health system. And thirdly, of these three key challenges, it's the climate change challenge. And in that, I want to maybe mention just some broad aspects of that before coming down to my own personal view of what the role of the universities specifically are more, particularly in this third challenge, the climate leap we have to make. It's one beyond compare, the scale of change we're committed to, which is set by science, Paris Climate Agreement being our guiding mechanism, our legal structure to decide what we do, to halve our emissions this decade. No one has ever done that. We're looking to cut our emissions at the moment, this first 5-year period, by 4.8% per annum. The reality is emissions last year went up. more than some 5%, so the scale of change is beyond compare. We have the right strategies and policies, in my mind, now in place in the National Development Plan, the Climate Action Plan based on the new climate law, which is very strong, the Housing for All strategy. This is all interconnected. But what we are absolutely focusing on now is the acceleration of delivery. We are establishing 6 acceleration task forces within government, which are designed to work in an open way, so that government departments work together, work with the other agencies, and work with broader society, and include the third level, our university sector in this, as a way in which we can feed in to the immediate challenge, the next 3 years. Forget about 2030, what do we do in the next 3 years? And those acceleration task forces are in offshore renewable energy, in sustainable mobility, in heating our buildings, in communicating about climate change, in delivering structures for a just transition, and last but not least, in developing a land use plan for the country that directs what happens in forestry and farming, in managing natural systems. I mentioned those 6 because we've only just started. The first of the meeting of the sustainability group, leadership group, took place about 2 weeks ago. Same with the offshore renewables, it's only started last month. And each of them they are starting. And they're starting to it's clearly in each of those 6 sectors. I might just pick out some examples of what's coming out as the things that is missing, the things that we need, the things that the university sector are going to have to look to see where they might be help provide some of the resources, skills, research capability. Just on the skill side, of what we need, if I could take some examples, Laura Burke's here with Laura, who's centrally involved and key in this whole land use plan and the development of it's not that we'd be directing every farmer, directing every forester what goes into every single hectare of land use, but it does need to shape what we're doing in land use to make this climate leap. And in that, Laura, you had a better expertise in terms of, but can I give one example of one of the problems as I see it? And this maybe sounds very micro, but very technical, but forestry, we're going to see a massive expanse in forestry. A huge requirement, up to I would expect something like 30% of the land use. We're currently 11 in being afforested by 2050 is a very sane prediction. We only have 2 university courses providing a stream of foresters into a system that is only delivering 2,000 hectares of forestation a year when it needs to go to at least 20,000 in no time. So what I'm saying to colleges around the country, making every opportunity, is we need foresters. And I think we also need to look at farming and bringing young people into farming. And how does that critically important training and educational program work? Because it's not happening at this present time. What we're seeing is an intensification, increasing use of contractors, bringing in workers often into the country in the agricultural sector. We need to start thinking the basic role of our education system is where are our foresters and where's the training of farmers for this future? Where's our agricultural colleges switching to the sort of needs we need there? Secondly, and I'm only just picking some examples here, if I look at the offshore renewables, and this actually applies in so many different teams, but if you look at what we're short of, what is the blockage, what's the key constraint, we are full steam ahead in developing offshore wind, in new maritime planning legislation, new auction system. We're just in the middle of opening up the auction for the first phase of projects. But actually the biggest constraint is we don't have sufficient planners. We don't have a sufficient number of ecologists. We don't have a sufficient number of marine scientists to do the planning that will allow us to open up the possibility. So any university involved in providing those skills is going to be, that's another area where we have an immediate need to accelerate dramatically the number of scientists that are available for that project as one of the examples. And I'm just concentrating here for the moment, first of all, on the skills, on the talent we need coming through. And it could keep going on in each sector. In the sustainable mobility, Lorraine Darcy will know this, that actually the biggest constraint is people. We put out an open call for teams within the area of active travel. I think it was some 250, 200 plus places. We can't fill them. We don't have the engineers. We don't have the urban planning, kind of softer landscape and other skills to fill those positions, or certainly it's proven really difficult. So again there, if you look, where's the skills need, that is actually the biggest constraint. The biggest problem we have in rolling out a lot of the climate mitigation, both mitigation and adaptation, is a shortage of people. And it could keep going through each sector to point out that in the whole area of retrofitting, it's the 30,000 or so construction workers that we need is again the key constraint. So first and foremost, I have to say, in the delivery of these, particularly in these 6 acceleration task force teams, the first thing government will be doing, the most important thing government will be doing, is coming to say, where are the foresters, where are the ecologists, where's the construction workers, where's the scientific expertise that we need to meet this development and this goal. More broadly, and on the research, I suppose, on the research side, and I suppose I come from maybe a bias in this. My first job was in University College Dublin, my second job. I briefly worked outside in consultancy world, but before getting a job in University College Dublin, running the marketing development program in UCD. And that informs me because that was action learning, working with industry. We were taking young graduates and putting them in industry to learn by doing. And that connection between the academic world and the real world, I might call it, it's not, the academic world's real too, but that kind of approach to university work in terms of where it is in conjunction with industry and other NGOs and other elements of society, in my mind, it brings real benefits. It brings benefits to the industry, obviously, to the state, in deploying the skills in the university out, but also in the type of learning, in the learning by doing, which I think in research world increasingly today, that is particularly in the climate leap that we need to make, such as the speed and scale of the change, that learning by doing is going to be a key part of the research world. And whether that's in the massive big projects, I remember going to Science Foundation Ireland, they were asking what sort of work should we be doing? And I said the big question we have is, how might we integrate 50 gigawatts of offshore wind into an island where there's only a 5 gigawatt demand? And how would we export or store or manage that? The research question in responding to that, what type of grid power system, what's the use of hydrogen or ammonia or other storage systems? That is obviously something that there's a huge amount of technical, independent research, innovation, physics and other chemistry and other analysis that needs to be developed. But everyone is now looking to develop and do that in real time, at scale and at speed. The Ukrainian war particularly has meant that we're going to have to do this in a far tighter and shorter deadline than maybe had been originally planned. So I would imagine every research university and every key, particularly in the energy area, is actually going to be drafted into this is not just a lab construct, this is how do we deploy in the next 7 years what maybe previously we thought would have happened in 2 or 3 decades. And I think that learning by doing in real time, and that's only one example of the huge scale of change that is coming. So that's the first principle I would have is not to be afraid. And I very much understand the benefit and the role of independent, but the primary research, discovering through just inquiry for its own sake, and the brilliant idea of a safe space for university where it's not under commercial pressure to deliver results and so on. I understand the need for that primary research and basic research. But the reality of the speed and requirement we need to make, the leap in climate change, a lot of it's going to be applied, and applied right up from that huge, big kind of sort of level of integrated grid management systems for electricity, down to how do we develop the quarter beside us here, the 2 bus stations, how do we develop some of the public lands and develop solutions in a very local level. That sort of the School of Architecture here maybe having a role in that, in a kind of a deployed, immediate response to our own local environment. Can I say two other points? And I'm sorry for this is very general, but as I said, it's where I come from. One of the other roles, I believe, of our universities. So it's providing skills, it's connecting to industry. I believe it's also a critical and key role in public debate, because we live in a world where social media is a very strong and a very beneficial role, but it tends towards divisive public debate, and it tends towards very inflammatory and often conflict-orientated public discussion. I believe there's an important role for academics to be out there in the public debate. There are people in this room, I could look no more further than Lorraine Darcy or Cara yourself, you haven't been shy about public debate. Mark, you and others in various universities here do this on a regular basis. Think of Hannah Daly down in the UCC. There are people all over the country, but they're notable by their presence and willingness to go into a very difficult environment to sometimes bring some rational, scientific, independent analysis to what are very contentious issues. And I think I would encourage that. I would support it. It's not easy. It's a very hostile, I know myself, it can be a hostile enough environment. But academics who are willing to put themselves out, and this is difficult. Remember someone saying, because scientists are often looking, or people are looking for categoric commentary, or sort of, give me the exact truth. And well, the truth sometimes in the science, when you get down to the real frontiers of scientific knowledge, is difficult to be categoric about. That's the very definition. It's an inquiring into an uncertainties is where we learn. And that willingness to go public and be public is very critical, but very, very difficult. And I would encourage that. I think public universities as part of a public realm is critical. I'm a UCD graduate. I believe in Cardinal Newman's idea of the university as a kind of a meeting place, this kind of very modern, liberal sense of sharing between different disciplines. And I think increasingly that these quads being open to the wider world in this way is particularly important. Lastly, of the various elements that I think the characteristics we should be looking at, and I'm really glad here today, the first thing I learned in arriving is that there is a European initiative here, whereas it's seven universities from eight different universities from eight different colleges, eight different universities across Europe are coming together, as I understand, to look at the establishment of effectively of a connected, united, single, open bachelor's program in sustainable scientific. I'm not sure the exact characteristics of what the discipline is, but this concept that 8 universities come together and work collaboratively, I think that's absolutely the right way to go and key. We published our innovation strategy on Wednesday, on the same day that the European Union published its Repower papers as to how we make the switch away from fossil fuels, Russian oil and gas and coal. And central stage in the European policy is a green transition, not just for climate reasons, not just now for energy security reasons, but a wider strategic understanding, I think, within the European Union, in that the world which we grew up in, me being 58 now, where we, the wealthiest 20% of the world, lived in a world where it was normal for us to consume 80% of the resources coming in from the rest of the world, that's not the economic future for the European Union. It won't be secure or a stable one. We're living in a world where other continents will start to rise, and resource limits mean that our current very precarious position, where we're dependent on imports for our energy, we're dependent on imports for our food, particularly animal grain food, we're dependent for our imports of software from the States and our hardware from China. That's not a sustainable position. So the European Union is making this strategic green leap because we're exposed, we're at risk. And I think the Commission and President von der Leyen and the strategy that's been proposed is absolutely the right one. My sense on the 4 European councils I'm on, that there's real unity within the council on this strategy and this approach. And if anything, the war in Ukraine has really solidified that. there was fear Europe a slight divide between maybe the more recent accession countries and the older. That is actually reducing somewhat in my mind because of what's happened in the Ukraine. So we need to seize this moment. And I think this, particularly in the area of energy and climate cooperation, everything is to be gained from cooperation. We're not, particularly when you switch to renewables, it's not a zero-sum game. Everyone has access to, be it solar power, wind power, hydropower, biomass power. Each of the countries in the Union have different access points to that. The real success of this new industrial revolution that's taking place is between the balancing between the variables, that variable power supply, which is the centre of the European Union strategy, and variable demand. So switching on and off electric vehicles, heat pumps, industrial applications, data centres, in tune with the available wind supply. But that won't work each country going by itself. It will only work in a balancing network, and grids are key here, where power is shifted over using often high voltage direct current cabling, using also hydrogen and other balancing systems. This is where the Industrial Revolution is going, as I see it. It is digital, it's low carbon, and it influences other areas like transport, which again will electrify and will be using a lot of those digital smart information systems, as will health and other areas. It's a circular economy, it's electric, it is balancing at the centre of everything. And so I think if that's the spirit of the technological industrial revolution that's taking place, which I see, well, then it makes sense that our universities are similarly nodal, interconnected, using remote learning technology now to share best practice, to do this learning by doing on a continental, regional first, but also continental basis. And that's what the European Union strategy is. That's what the Irish government strategy is. And I'm very pleased that there are 8 universities here from different European countries kind of signaling that they have a similar view as to where we're going. Thank you.
Ayman, if I could get you to join our panelists, and while you get comfy, I'll introduce the rest of our guests before we interrogate your very interesting speech there. So we are joined by an esteemed group of people: Laura Burke, Director of the Environmental Protection Agency; Ross Boyd, Vice President of Community and Citizenship at DCU Students' Union; Jennifer Boyer, who is the Vice President of Sustainability here at TU Dublin; and then remotely, Professor John O'Halloran, who is the President of University College Cork. Great to have such a wide range of experts, but I'll start with Ayman, with just some of the things that you mentioned in your speech there. I think you made it really clear that there's endless amounts of talent needed to address all of these things we have to do as part of the Climate Action Plan. So I think the big question for those of us who work in university is, where are the resources and funding coming from? Because obviously we're quite dependent in the universities now on bringing in master's students, and particularly international students, to fund teaching programs in the universities. But what you're talking about is undergraduate programs and maybe professional diplomas. So are there resources there to help create these new workers of tomorrow?
I think there are. I think we're coming out of what has been a very difficult period for Irish universities, where because of the financial crisis, there was a constraint on funding, and that was a very long tail of the effect of that, where the political system wasn't really able to answer the call that the Peter Cassell's report made in terms of need definitive, clear funding systems, whether it's loan or direct exchequer or other funding. I think that uncertainty is coming to an end. I think Simon Harris says we have agreement in government. I'm going to memory now. I think it's an additional 377 million, which is recognised we have to provide as exchequer system to close the gap, and that's separate to. We won't be going down a loan-based, system. There's clear viewpoint in that, or view on that it will require additional exchequer funding, and I hope that at least it goes a long way to closing the immediate gap. And any further developments in terms of well, European or other funding, we'll have to look at. But my understanding is that funding is now committed, and I'm trusting. I listen to the universities as whether it does immediately address some of the real shortfalls we had. My understanding is it's staff we need, just like in so many other areas. It is the number of academics. The teacher-student, the university lecturer-student ratio was allowed to grow too large, and that's where I think the funding and investment needs to go into. Of that 300 million or so, I think it's primarily numbers in our universities. If I'm what I sense is what's needed.
You talk a lot about the vision for Ireland in 2030, and a lot of the questions, most of the questions that I'm drawing from today were actually submitted in advance from people who registered for this event, and one of them was actually, what's your vision for what universities look like in 2030 if they're part of this transition? Because obviously they have their own environmental impact at the moment that needs to be addressed.
I think, well, God's big question now, but 2 or 3. One of the things I do think we need a role in, we do need to change. I mean, the universities have a big influence on our CAO system and our whole, who's going into what from university. And I do think our system is no longer serving us. It has served us very well. And by any record, we've one of the highest levels of third-level participation in Europe. We've one of the highest level of schools completion. We do very well on our PISA. So our economy is a clearly highly capable, functioning, high-quality manufacturing, high-quality environment in so many different ways. But our CAO system sucks in terms of what it's saying to young people and giving them slightly more freedom. And I do think there's a real need for us to switch towards more apprenticeships, more, what I was saying, forestry, farming. And like, if you look at what we need, construction, that's what we're going to need in the low-carbon economy. And the current system does steer us for what the CAO system and the points rate system in a very unfair way now, because even if you do the very best, you're into a raffle as to what course you get. So I think, firstly, one of the things that does need to change, and I think it comes from the universities, because they, in a sense, they manage the entrance system, and I don't think the entrance system is serving us well at the moment. That's first, so I can't avoid making that point. But then secondly, well, I look at TUD here now, Dublin, as a really good example of city centre, sustainable mobility prioritised, close to public transport, really high quality campuses, and I do think the urban aspect of our, I mean, to be careful now here, but there's nothing wrong with being not urban, but but in Newman's ideal of a meeting place, university as a kind of that what a quadrangle does give you, that space of kind of for reflection, for socializing, for it's not just that it's low carbon, it also needs to be what we're saying in public realm. Well, universities need to be brilliant at public realm. That's what they always have been and should be. They came from the monastic tradition, I suppose, the kind of sense of a quiet space where you meet and talk. Yeah. And that's where universities, and I think TUD is looking really good in that light. Absolutely.
I saw John nodding vigorously on some of the points you made. So John, maybe you could just come in there and follow on. Do you think campuses need to go beyond this kind of greening and into more integration of sustainable development goals, or some of the other things that Ayman was referring to?
Thank you so much, and I'm keeping my carbon footprint low by being in Cork today, so thank you for joining me.
Well done.
Can I also say thanks to the Minister for that really important paper that he just presented, and just to not forget that today is World Bee Day, and pollinators are critically important for our planet. And as an ecologist and Professor of Zoology first, and then President, just to acknowledge that, and it is important. But no, you make a really important number of points there, and I think the Minister, before I answer directly the question, I think the Minister and the government have served us incredibly well during COVID. And there is a lesson to learn here. And the Minister and the narrative from our government has been clear. It says, follow the science. And I think if we can, as a higher education institution, can support the government on following the science in climate action and on sustainability, I think there's a real chance of success. Specifically to your question then, I think the whole idea of SDGs and environmental sustainability is central to the conversation piece. And for me as an ecologist, but maybe for many others, environmental sustainability is often the entry point for people and provides an opportunity for people to feel connected to sustainability. You know, when we look at SDGs, we're talking about just transition. The Minister mentioned this. There is a strong gender dimension to climate impacts. We need to make sure that we're addressing both the societal implications of our climate goals, which can be achieved through the SDGs. And like many universities, University College Cork, we have deeply mapped our curriculum against the SDGs. And I'm really pleased to see the government's draft and implementation plan being a draft that I've seen. The National SDG Implementation Plan has used UCC's toolkit to help people to implement that into their curriculum. We've also mapped our research, and we're to continue to do that. And also our student services onto the 17 goals. So in some ways, the universities are small communities, and we can be the test bed for implementation, but also for acting on these really important initiatives, including our sports clubs. And, you know, so it is about connection. So I think it is about the entry into the SDGs. It is about supporting. And it's what I often say, it's about the head, the hands and the heart. So universities we provide the intellectual capacity through research and teaching and learning. Hopefully we have an empathic element to us, but also at giving the skills. And in Cork, myself and Maggie Cusack from Munster Technological University, and indeed with the ETBs, we've been looking at the ecosystem, the education ecosystem that can achieve the objectives of today. So what does that mean? It means electricians and electrical engineers and researchers working in the same ecosystem, working together to confront the problem. So there will be my initial observations. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Jennifer, you've been getting a lot of compliments of your beautiful campus here. It's my first time actually being here too, and also really impressed with the accessibility and, you know, how it's so much part of the community. What's your view on how universities approach sustainability? Do they do it strictly in an environmental sense, or is it also a social and economic sense too? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we've made huge progress in Grange-Gorman, and we now have all of our campuses under one university, finally, and Tala and Blanchardstown. And actually, the approach to how we plan in the future for our campuses is an absolutely critical question for sustainability. So that question of efficiency and access and openness and equality is central. So I think we're having to do a big rethink. You know, it's like starting with the first step of the circular economy. Rethink, where are we at? What are we using our assets and our resources to do to be more efficient, to be more responsible? And it is you need a systems thinking approach to it all, and it's not unlike CAO, where you actually have to think a little bit differently about what's not working. So I think if we're trying to be more efficient and responsible with the resources of our campuses, it's going to force us to think about new models. So new workload models, new models for our education, which is actually, you know, very much student-led, because our students are impassioned by sustainability. They get it. They also have the most at stake. So they are going to drive a huge amount of our change, and we as a university have to be able to adapt to their needs in terms of delivering on that. Notwithstanding what the minister has said about the skills and actually the hard work we have to do, which is a human resource requirement over the next while. So I think, you know, that wholesale change that needs to happen is going to be really hard, and I think we do have a lot of ways to go. Particularly nice to see kind of 4-day working weeks being piloted by Irish companies, and fully remote working roles being advertised out in the public. But I think, you know, the question of gender equality is enormous. And that's one of the things I think that we're going to have to culturally start to address as we develop our campuses into the future.
Interesting. Ross, obviously students are central to everything Jennifer's saying, and that's your role as VP of Citizenship and Community. How do you think we bring students along in this move toward a more sustainable campus?
Well, I think to bring students along, you need to have them as active participants in every stage of how universities work in sustainability. It's about ensuring that students can do these grassroots projects, whether it be on having these sustainable markets, having these societies and clubs involved, but also ensuring that they're on the head and talking to university management. Especially myself and the Students' Union, it'll be involved in being on the Sustainability Council and specifically ensuring that from the working group of students, that students can directly feed into what I say and to lead in Sustainability Council and how that works. But I think the change that we need is monumental on this. I think especially in the ECU's case of the 2020, of the goal map towards 2030, and according to the 2020 emissions target, we actually wouldn't have reached it if it was a 2030 at the same time. So very much, that's how much change it is, where there is no students on campus, we still can't meet our 2030 targets, and that is what a change needs. But I think also looking at it, especially, I'm glad to hear about the Sustainable Development Goals and how it needs to be an approach of not just sustainability, but also climate justice, and very much looking at the way of engaging students in multiple ways that they can see what their progress and impact is on the campus, but also make these choices as well, whether that be on how they learn their education, whether it be more remote, or how they travel to university, whether it be through active travel or other measures, and also ensuring those costs are down, that it is easy as possible for those students to get involved as well, and ensuring as well that where they learn these sort of skills, that they can learn it in the lecture halls as well, and what skills exactly we teach in these lecture halls too is very much applicability to what they are studying, and ensuring that the sustainability aspect to all of it, and that in this all, that the actual staff and lecturers can also be empowered and passionate to actually be able to teach that skills as well, because very much it needs to be a dialogue, it needs to be a conversation on sustainability that is throughout all aspects of what an education may be, and empower us to say what is the future generation, but as well as the previous generations and the older generations as well. It needs to be a holistic approach in all those ways.
Yeah, presumably the active travel one is really important, because if you get used to traveling actively as a college student, you might carry that over into your working life too. So that's probably a huge one to bring forward. Laura, as director of the EPA, you obviously have a vision for how Ireland can transition in 2030, and possibly even how university campuses can transition, given EPA is located very close to UCD, and also involved in this Living Labs project with universities. So maybe you could talk a bit about what that is and how that's leading us to more sustainable universities.
Well, I might just take a step back, first of all, in the context of kind of the vision and where we'd see the universities. And as I would see it, as kind of the head of an environmental organisation, big organisation at this stage, 450 staff right across the country, and we have some of those challenges about transport and all of those sort of things that everybody else has. But looking at the vision, a number of years ago when you were looking at environmental policy, really people were saying, can we pollute less? You know, and that was the mantra of environmental policy. Then we moved into kind of a stage of saying, be more efficient. And use your resources more efficiently. And we've seen that even in the context of debate, maybe in agriculture in Ireland, around efficiency. I think now we're at the stage is we need all sectors to completely reinvent themselves. And that means then, in the context of universities, you need a completely different skill set and a completely different mindset. So what you're looking at is developing curious minds. I think that's the ultimate for me around universities is developing that mindset. And then in the context of kind of, again, universities, scientists and all of us, and I say even as an EPA, we tend to be organised in a very highly fragmented way. So you're an ecologist, you're a climate scientist, you're a water scientist, and we look at all of them as separate. That's not going to work in reinventing society overall. Scientists and universities, I think, need to see themselves as connectors with people. How do we connect with people? You know, the Minister was talking about that public facing and engagement, but also connecting with all different sectors of society and connecting with each other, because you're not going to get behavioural change, you're not going to get the change unless you have the cross-disciplinarity. And then it's how you transform the data to useful knowledge. You know, and again, a challenge, we're quite an academic organisation, translating data, it's great to have all that data, but what do you do with it? And again, key for the university sector. And then coming on to the Living Lab aspect of it, and this is, you know, where the EPA is funding it's great to be funding a university association rather than funding individual universities, again showing that connection piece, but using the universities as a laboratory. 160,000 students across the universities. They are small cities in their own right, so they can be test beds for whether it's waste reduction, food waste, recycling, all of these sort of things. And I think it's a perfect test bed, and that's really what we're trying to do with the Living Labs.
And where is that in its kind of stages of development? Is it early?
There's lots of initial work has happened in the context of you know, even in student accommodation, looking at what's the waste generated. Some of this is basic stuff, but you need the basics to know what type of waste is generated And then from those surveys, then how do you reduce it and how do you avoid it, etc. So a lot of that preliminary work is done. And now there's work with a number, I think there's 4 of the universities have signed up. So I won't start doing naming and shaming of which ones have and haven't, but to be looking specifically at food waste. We know that food waste, it is a big climate issue, it's a big monetary issue when you're talking about cost of living. And overall, it's a quick win in many ways, because if you're a student, I'd much rather be spending my money on a few pints of a Friday night than spending it on food and then things being wasted, etc. And that's all of us. So how do we get best use of the canteens? How do we offer the appropriate types of meals that aren't ending up being wasted? All of those sort of things. So that's the next big project with the universities.
Great. Well, I'll be measuring our food waste a bit more easily. Ayman, you mentioned some of the research that needs to be involved and needs to happen in order to deal with some of these grid challenges and everything. And of course, the universities are core to all of this research. But do you think there needs to be more alignment between what the universities are doing in terms of research and looking at how those are scaled up, or even how well they align to government policy?
Well, I think it is being revised at the moment. As I said, there's new policy agreed on Wednesday, and Philip Nolan here, I think, will have a central role, because we're looking at a combination or combining the Irish Research Council and Science Foundation Ireland, and I think that will have, I presume, a very central role in the kind of the new approach to funding. So yes, it is changing, and I think there is. I come back to what I was saying. The main point I was making about this engagement with industry. I see the universities having a very particular beneficial role in public policy. I mentioned those acceleration teams because I think they were an attempt to do in the public service what we did well in COVID, which was, as Philip would know from memory, it was open. It wasn't as departmental, as it were, just each silo. So I hope that sort of using those acceleration teams, and where you've got the likes of our land use one, it'll be the EPA, it'll be Teagasc, it'll be departments of 2 or 3 or 4 government departments, and also an openness to academic or institutions to feed into sort of public policy issues that will evolve there. And we did that. I mean, the first meet, we did National Climate Dialogue there 2 months ago in Dublin Castle, and the characteristics of this innovation in this world is as open and transparent. I go back to Martin Curley because, people you're influenced by. Martin did Open Innovation 2.0. I was about 10 years ago. I don't know if anyone here was at it. Very simple analysis, and it was very much supported and funded by the European Commission. But he described what it is, the quadruple helix of innovation. But that is that quadruple helix of government, industry, civil society and academia, universities, and that they have to work openly with each other, whether it's a lab or whether it's through government-funded support schemes and so on. But I think that basic idea, and Ireland is a small country where there's relatively high level of trust in the state, and which has a very advanced kind of capabilities in some of these areas. If we use that open helix method of government, civil society, academic and industry innovating together, that I think is what will work.
Yeah, presumably you all have views on this idea that we do need to engage more with enterprise and with outside, groups. Jennifer, maybe you have some thoughts on how we do that better.
Yeah, I mean, I think the quadruple helix model is it's a fantastic prospect of actually how you bring all of those existing human resources together and all of those needs and challenges. And recently we were awarded HCI funding for a national architecture curriculum revision, which deploys this quadruple helix model. So you engage with the local authority areas that each of the HEIs are in, you draw in enterprise, you draw in industry, we've brought in the professional body, and we're basically piloting for climate change and housing. We're saying, where are the challenges? How can we deploy our students, our intelligence, through this kind of open process, which is very workshop-based, which is then delivering examples of what the future should look like. And I think that type of environment is resource-heavy. It's intense. And to do that, and picking up on what Laura said about the living labs, that's a very organizational learning type of integration model that we need to reach that maturity level to be able to achieve, to deploy the resources that we have as universities in the fullest extent possible. So there's a huge human demand challenge there, and it requires design thinking and systems thinking skills. It requires collaboration for a common good as opposed to competition between, and that's a very different mindset.
Yeah. John, I'm sure UCC faces this challenge too. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, I think we have to, as we saw this week from the Minister Harris, we got to work from discovery right through to applied sciences. And I think a lot of the early ecological biodiversity work and climate work was not funded by the state, was not funded by the European Commission, but by the universities themselves and through other scholars working. So we need that constant pure research going on right through to the applied side. And certainly here at University College Cork, we're lucky to host the SFI Marai Centre for Climate and Marine Research, which I know Minister Ryan in his earlier career was responsible for accelerating that really important piece of work. And we feel that engaging with policymakers is critical actually to enable the translation that has already been mentioned. And it's a translation into policy, and we are lucky, people like Hannah Daly, which the Minister has mentioned, but Brino Gallagher, who is a really significant actor in the energy area, particularly in Marai, has been a very strong advocate in informing policy. And we also have people seconded from DFERIS actually working in UCC for the connections between the government departments and our universities. So I think we need this sense of connection. And finally then on the international stage, we're really proud that UCC has observer status at the climate conference COP26, and we're already preparing for COP27. So I think not only we have the responsibility to do it, but also we have to have the capacity to deliver on it. And finally, I think the universities are not the white horses going into communities. We need to go into those communities and listen to the issues. Dingle 2030 is a good example. The IUA did a great news program on this, where we go in and listen to the communities, because wisdom sits in many places. And with our researchers, whether it's in the social element, whether it's the technical element, then we can make a real difference. So I think we need pure research right through to the highly applied stuff, and SFI have played a significant role in supporting that. Thank you.
Yeah. John, Laura, John actually mentions this whole idea of going into communities, and I think that's something that EPA deals with all the time, and going into businesses and everything. So how do you think universities can do that better?
I think it's kind of part of it is a mindset change, because and again I think often it's been the government departments did their thing, the agencies did their thing, the university did their thing, etc. And it is for all of us to be open to talking and learning from each other. And I think certainly over the last number of years, we've been very proactive in the agency to be out there talking to communities, whether that's be on climate change, whether it be on other issues, because you learn so much. And that's the bit. You're not going and talking at people. You are listening and hearing a perspective. And we can hear lots of different perspectives. We can agree and we can disagree, but ultimately it's going in with that open mind so that you can learn and try and come up with a common understanding. And then from that you can build into solution mode. And again, that's whether it's engagement with industry in particular things, or the academic sector, or in the community sector as well. But it is all, for me, it's all around that common understanding and listening to each other.
Yeah, Ross, one of the problems with students is that they're always leaving. You get them trained up and then they're off, into the working world. So how do you think we bring students into this and make them partners in the kind of things we're talking about today?
Well, I think it's probably mostly the inclusion part of it, and showing that students are part of the stakeholders and crucial part of the stakeholders at every level, I think, in this. Very much ensuring especially that it is the students who get to see the visual impact, they get the first-hand experience of how the universities are doing, and we'll be the very first people to tell you if you're doing something good or something not so good. They'll be the first ones on the street, as some would say as well. So definitely in terms of that way, it's ensuring that the students can actually get involved directly in any of these actions, that they want to help out as well, but I think also that they're limited, especially when it comes to having to get their education, also maybe having to work a part-time job and have to pay fees at the same time, and also ensuring that there's a way of looking at the systemic change in that way too. But I think especially when it comes back to what the community folks have been, I think especially working with social enterprises, and especially ensuring that, because these social enterprises will get students involved in that way. For example, in DC we have a community garden, and that gets students to have a brief tour and visit up there, and it's then also be able to see those vintage markets be able to see those where I think for a Green Week, for example, we had a actual carbon costing of the meals in the canteen, and it's actually those ways of students can actually see what those actions are, and then very much want to see how they can sort of improve it more and more, and looking especially in ways of ensuring that these students are very much going to be the ones who are going to be taking these skills into their own local communities, so very much ensuring that this is very much instilled in them, and very much, even if students are being replaced, that is a community culture, and it's very much facilitated in not just a student level, but also in a higher management level, and that they have the resources especially to have those projects, because very much students have the ideas. However, sometimes delivery might not be possible because of resources or financing, and I especially know that Minister Ryan mentioned the increase in higher education funding, and that's very much welcome in that, especially on staff resourcing especially, and ensuring if you get those ideas, then the students are very much happy to help out in that way too.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Just
jump in.
the other piece there, I think, is around internships and opportunities to work, to be in the workplace. And the reason I say it is, I suppose for all of us, and it's a long time ago since I was in college, but I do remember coming out, and the first thing that the university lecturer said to me is, just remember you know nothing. And it was a bit of a harsh lesson, but when you go into the kind of the real world, I suppose somebody said, but a different world, actually having done internships, having been out in the workplace, and the students will bring loads to the organisation as well as vice versa. And we, the agency, do the student summer programme, but also more recently have developed an internship programme, and it is absolutely brilliant. It's the best thing we've ever done, because as an organisation, we've benefited, and I would hope, and I hear back the students have as well. So is that cross-fertilisation of ideas, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
I'd like to make one other comment as well on the back of that, because I think it can't be said enough that students are the future. They need the agency and they need the authority to come in and make decisions with us. And I think that they have the potential to be the leaders. And so you talk about leadership in the area. There needs to be leadership from all levels in order to transform what needs to happen here. And I think by encouraging that kind of conversation that we're all learning, and that actually, to hear something like that, like nothing and go out and learn, it's like, oh my God, but we all have something we can give. And actually, it requires us all to give now to this conversation to make change happen.
Yeah. Ayman, one of the comments from the audience was regarding the Department of Further and Higher Education and whether or not they should really be engaging in some kind of sectoral strategy for the universities to help them transition to meet our 2030 and 2050 targets. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think first, go back to what I was saying, the question around about support and funding for universities. I was just thinking afterwards, actually, the establishment of a government department for the third level sector was a very significant statement of intent and an important one. And I think, go back to what I was saying again further as well there, I mentioned that 307 million was, I think, that to kind of close the gap. I think that's just to close the gap on the staffing, is my sense. From now, listen, this is Simon's department, so I'm very careful here. But there's a separate gap in research, on core research funding, despite the creation of Science Foundation Ireland and the significant budget there and so on. As I understand, if you look at this statistically, a percentage of GNI probably is the best one we'd have to pick. How much are we actually spending in third level research? And for a country which is so engaged, so much of its revenue comes from advanced manufacturing, very high tech services sector, our spend on the research side, core basic research, is low. And I do think that's a wider, longer, separate issue, and I don't know how Simon's going to crack that in terms of the. But that is, I think, I know that on a regular basis, government's tough because you're looking at priorities and you're asking very different questions around. So, like we're going to have to spend on defence, we're going to have to spend on childcare, we're going to have to spend on keep public transport fares low. The list as long as your arm. But there is a separate issue, and maybe Philip would know in terms of where's the money coming from in terms of increased research. It doesn't all have to come from the state. Like a lot of it, what's happening here, John was saying that the universities themselves similarly invest in a lot of the climate stuff before government or elsewhere. I think similarly, a lot of businesses in our country will and should and can now start to invest in fairly advanced research here and are doing a lot of fairly advanced research here. So it's not just government. But I think the Taoiseach says, and I think he's right, we do need further funding for
core, primary, often no ties attached to it research. I think there is a shortfall there.
Yeah. John, what do you think are the supports that might be required from senior management in universities to deal with these problems?
I think there's a whole range of them. So here at University College Cork, there are different ways we've looked at it. There's a framework, there's a strategy, and I believe the leadership and opportunities, if I was to frame them that way. So the framework is where we set out our strategy. So UCC in 2006, we established our sustainability strategy. So that set out the framework in which we work. And we have just coming back to our student representative, we have a simple mission in our green agenda and sustainability agenda at UCC. It's student-led, it's research-informed, and it's practice-focused. Because students are constantly coming in, as you've mentioned, they're coming in each year, they've got great ideas, but we've got to rely on the science. So research is critical to this. And then we've got to be focused on how we operate as organizations. 78% of public sector education buildings are old buildings. So we've got to find technologies to support those. So we've got to make sure that we have the strategies in place. Then we've also got, was mentioned by our student again, we have to support our students. So we have initiatives here for supporting projects where students are actually funded to undertake short projects. And also what I call, so that's the top-down piece. And then the bottom-up piece is our student activism, which was referenced, and it's really, really important. Students have really great ideas. Some of them are daft, and that's okay. We can try these. A research-intensive university should do that. So we need to support our students. And there's a piece then what I call the middle-out piece. They're the real actors across the organisation which bring the real change. So I think we have to provide the leadership, the opportunities, and the framework for those kinds of transformations to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've run out of time, but I want to ask one final question in just 2 or 3 words that I'm hoping all of you can answer. I'm really throwing you into it now. I thought it was a great one from the audience. What do you think the university sector could look like in 2030, having transformed itself? In just a few words, if possible.
I think for Ireland, we have a nimbleness and a level of innovation and coherence that we could achieve that would speak to the world in terms of delivering on something, like a sustainability curriculum, as well as what a new university looks like. So.
Great vision, way more than 3 words. Jennifer, Ayman, go ahead.
In 3 words, quality, not quantity.
Very good. I like it. Very good. Well done. Anybody else before we end? It's hard to
I'll
beat
come
that.
back. Again, it's that foster curious minds. I think just to me, it keeps coming back to that.
Excellent.
I was saying...
Jump in.
Oh, you're coming first, is he?
Go ahead, John. Do you want to jump in?
So I would say inclusion.
Inclusion.
I would say curiosity and collaboration.
Very good. Yeah. And Ross?
I say funded, I would say open, and I would also say generally community-led.
All great words. Well, hopefully that's some inspiration for all of us to take with us today. So thank you all, the panel, for joining us. Minister Ryan, Laura Burke, Jennifer Boyer, Ross Boyd, and of course, Professor O'Halloran for joining us online. And also thank you to Professor David Fitzpatrick and Lisa Saputo for kindly hosting today's event at TU Dublin. So thank you to those online, to the in-person audience. And this Future of Ireland event will actually take place again on June 9th, where we'll be talking to the director of Science Foundation Ireland, Philip Nolan, on the new national research strategy and what it means for our sector and our country. But until then, as Laura says, stay curious. Thank you very much.